Hello everyone, welcome to May's Heritage Live with Coquitlam Heritage. We are coming to you from Mackin House, which is located on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Coquitlam First Nation, on whose land we work, live, and play. My name is Abby Lise, and I'm the Operations Coordinator for Coquitlam Heritage. Today's presentation is in conjunction with our current exhibit, 38th Parallel, the 71st Anniversary of the Korean War, which is on display at Coquitlam Library City Center Branch until May 31st. Our special guest today is Frank Smyth, a veteran of the Korean War who will be giving a short presentation about his experience. Frank Smyth enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1950 at the age of 17 and trained to become a paratrooper. He tried twice to go to Korea with his infantry unit, but was stopped because of his age and disciplined. He tried to get his documents altered to say he was older, but with no success. He then joined the Canadian Provo Corps, which is also known as the military police, and after training, arrived in Korea when the war had ended. At the time, it was uncertain whether or not the ceasefire would hold, so he was in Korea for just under 2 years. Afterwards, he also served in Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, and Jamaica with Canada's peacekeeping operations. We will be doing a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, so if you are joining us on the Zoom webinar, there is a Q&A icon where you can type in your questions. I will also be monitoring the Facebook Live, so if you have any questions, you can type them in as a comment, and when Mr. Smyth has finished his presentation, we will answer any questions you have. Feel free to ask a question during any part of the presentation, and we will get them to them at the end. And with that, I'm going to send this over to Frank.
Thank you, Abby. Good morning. I would first like to give you just a brief outline of the history of Korea since the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel. The north was under communist influence and the south under democracy. In 1950, in June, the North Korean army, which had been heavily equipped by China and Russia, without provocation or warning, invaded South Korea. The South Korean troops that were there with some U.S. forces were overwhelmed and pushed back to Pusan with very heavy losses. The United Nations, which was still in its infancy, had just been formed a few years before, was asked to intervene. They sent out the call, and 22 countries offered to serve and send forces. 16 countries, including Canada, committed combat forces. The other 6 countries committed medical and logistical services. These forces were committed to Korea without any of the participating countries declaring war, which you can imagine caused many headaches for the civil service and politicians trying to figure out what to do when you commit troops to fight, but there's no declared war. The units were diversified by language, training, equipment, uniforms, culture, and every other thing. However, they got the job done. And in 1953, July, a ceasefire was arranged. It was not an end to the war. The countries, North and South Korea, are still at war as we speak. The demilitarized zone, known as the DMZ at the 38th parallel, is the heaviest defended border in the world. The war created terrible devastation in human lives and infrastructure. It has been estimated that the loss in human life was as high as 3 million casualties, both civilian and military. Many thousands more were displaced and became refugees, and overwhelmed whatever resources had been available to handle them. South Korea had always been the agricultural portion of the Korean peninsula. Rice paddies, vegetables. The North had all the factories, the mines, the minerals, and the resources. In 1953, South Korea was the 189th economy in the world. 60 years later, they're the 8th largest economy in the world. South Korea has been called the most technologically advanced country in the world. They lead the world in electronics, steelmaking, shipbuilding, textiles, and have a major car and appliance industry. South Korea has achieved all of this by education, innovation, and hard work. And I would like to just point out, South Korea does not have one single natural resource. Everything is imported. They've developed and innovated. It was a very cultural shock for young men, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, to see such hunger, devastation, and poverty. There were no paved roads. All the bridges had been blown up. The airstrip, Gimpo Airport, was a dirt runway. When the monsoons hit, the roads washed out. So it didn't have a lot to work with. And we had never seen such hunger or poverty, even though you came from maybe working class families in Canada. You'd never seen anything like it. So one of the first jobs I ever had in Korea was keeping people back from a garbage dump. Now this sounds strange, except they were so desperate to get at the food that had been thrown out that when the dump trucks were dumping their loads, they were running to get at them, and there was a danger of being crushed by the trucks. There had been injuries. So we were forced to hold back elderly women and children, pushing them with rifles to prevent them from getting in and getting hurt. And then when the trucks had pulled out, they swarmed to get at the food. They would always go out into the minefields and everywhere to search for wood. Wood was very scarce. Their homes were heated by wood underneath the floor. They all slept on the floor. The Japanese had almost deforested South Korea during their 47-year occupation. Anyway, they would go out and risk their lives to get little twigs and pieces of wood to heat and cook with. And they would also go out there to collect brass shell casings, both from artillery shells and bullets. And the reason they did this, they would take them and they would make brass art. In our display down at the Coquitlam Central Library, there are 2 cups and saucer sets. They were made by my houseboy, Hank, and engraved to my mother and father. And they were made from the brass of artillery shells. Now, some people think this was very innovative for the Korean children and people to do. I'd like to show you here some items I have that were given to me by my uncle, who was with my father and grandfather in the First World War, and this was called trench art. This 20 millimeter shell is a cigarette lighter. And this is another type of lighter. And that was called trench art. I'm sure it was, so it survived 3 wars, and I'm sure they're doing it in Afghanistan. I suppose the worst memories that most people have is the destruction, poverty, and it's always the elderly and the children that seem to suffer the most. If they have food, of course, they give it to their soldiers. And we used to have clothing and toys sent over from Canada. I was fortunate. I had a mother and 4 older sisters who all used to go out and get T-shirts and toys and things for the kids, and we'd take them down to the villages. And that was probably one of the highlights and the good spots. Anyway, I will now pause and see if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask me.
Thank you for that. We do have a few questions so far. So you mentioned in the bio about you that 17 was too young to serve in the army. So what were the typical ages of people serving in the Korean War?
Well, you had to be 19 to go to Korea. Many lied, but they lied when they joined and used phony ID. So they were able to get over younger. I know there were some people that were 15 that got over, and there were many 16, 17-year-olds. Because I was playing by the rules, they told me I had to get a letter of permission from my parents. So my mother and father had to sign a release for me to join the Army at 17, 2 weeks after my 17th birthday. You'd never get away with that today, signing a waiver. However, that was the way it was done. So trying to get over before was a no-no. But the trouble was, all the men that you trained with had already gone over, and you were held back. So, and I would say you had two types of ages in the Korean War. You had men who had served in World War II, who just didn't adjust back to civilian life, so came back in for the Korean War, where they probably missed the comradeship and the training and the lifestyle. And then you had the young 17, naive, adventure-seeking kids out of high school. So you had that two balanced. So age-wise, up there and down here.
Okay. So what were the living conditions like for you, and what were they like for the Korean people at the time you were in Korea?
Well, for the Korean people, it was pretty bad. Whole villages had been devastated and knocked down. The bridges, as they say, the roads were plugged, and the refugees were still all over, and they were trying to forage for food. We would give them as much as we could from what we had. And for us, we lived in, if you were up at the front, you lived either in trenches, foxholes, or bunkers. If you were in the rear echelon, you lived in tents. And I should mention that the climate in Korea is very harsh. The winters are extremely cold. The winds come straight down from Mongolia. In the summertime, it gets up to 40 and 42 Celsius and extremely high humidity. And then you have the monsoons, which is in late August, and that just washes out everything, and floods. And then you get the fall and springs, which are probably the best time. My first revisit with my wife was in April, was very pleasant. We went back in July 5 years ago, and it was so humid. They had to change a lot of the venues for us to be inside rather than an outside ceremony, simply because of the temperatures, 40, 42. And as I was saying to someone, we had a convoy of 4 buses, a police escort, a nurse on every bus with a complete medical kit with defibrillators, followed by an ambulance. So it was quite a convoy. But living conditions were sparse, a little bit primitive, and you were in close quarters, 4 men to a tent or a hoochie, and you better get along with these guys because you're. And bathing wasn't a luxury that you got very often. So you used to have to wash in your helmet, sponge bath sort of thing. So yeah, different.
Yeah, absolutely. So what were some things that bothered you the most when you were serving?
The children.
Yeah.
And the poor, hunger, and just devastation. I mean, the place was just a wreck. You wouldn't believe it now. It's absolutely a modern day miracle of what they've done with their country. Quick example, the river, the Han River in Seoul. When we left, there was 4 bridges. 3 of them were completely blown up, and the 4th was all shattered. When my wife and I went back first time about 12 years ago, they had just opened the 31st bridge. 31. And every one of those bridges is mined to be blown up in case if the war starts again. All their roads, our main highways, are designed as landing strips for aircraft. All the tunnels, when you go through them, if you look up at the ceiling, there's a big indentation in the ceiling where they're mined to explode and drop big blocks of cement to block the tunnels. So everything there is on a wartime footing, 24/7, hasn't changed.
Wow. So we have a question on Facebook. Were there many orphans from the war?
Hundreds of thousands. The sad part of it is the children that were the orphans of a combination of the veteran and the Korean woman, they wore a baseball hat that was marked OK, and it meant Orphan of Korea. And you were encouraged to give them because they were not accepted by either side. They couldn't go back to the United States, and the Korean people didn't treat them very well. So yeah, that was the sad part. It was the orphans, but many sad part of parents getting killed or lost. Almost every male served in the military. Even today, male service in the Korean Armed Forces is compulsory. It's not an option.
Okay. So why do you think this conflict was important?
Well, it was the first conflict of sort of communism versus democracy. And everybody was afraid of that expression they've used, the domino philosophy. They used that to rationalize Vietnam too. They're afraid that if one country falls to communism, then the others will follow suit. But it was also the first time the United Nations had ever committed armed forces to intervene in a conflict. So it was it was most unusual. It set the tone, but it still was an awkward situation when no one declared war.
Yes.
And they didn't call it a war. Harry Truman called it a police action. In Canada, it was referred to as the Korean conflict. It was only probably 15, 20 years ago it was actually declared the Korean War. And if you look at the monument in Ottawa, it says on the side, Korean War. So it still was an awkward situation many years later.
So you mentioned a little bit about the difference in Korea now. Did you want to expand on that?
Well, everything is so modern, like their transportation system. My wife and I, on our tour, we went down to the United Nations cemetery in Busan, and we were taken down on the bullet train. Mm-hmm. We left Seoul on this very modern train, and you sit in like first class airline seats, and there's TV sets above each seat, and you travel at 325 kilometers an hour. And the train never moves at all. Now, when we arrived in Korea, we got on a smoke, belching old black smoke type engine with the cars that were all shot up, no windows, wooden benches nailed to the floor, and a hole in the floor for the washroom. That was our welcome to Korea, the train. And this was a little bit different than that bullet train we were on.
And after, of course, 28 days of being on a ship.
28 days on the ship, and at 495 men per compartment. When I say compartment, it's not like a stateroom. It's like a big compartment. Mm-hmm. And you're stacked about 5 high. Wow. With all your equipment.
So we have another question on Facebook. Can you talk a bit about train busting?
Yes, the Canadian Navy, and a little bit of trivia, has the world's record for train busting by Navy. They used to come in close to the Korean coastline and knock out the North Korean supply trains that were coming down with supplies. And HMCS Crusader has the record. It has five or six. And we have one of the members of our unit was on that ship. And many others, the Athabascan, the Cayuga, they all had 3, 4. And in the Navy, they paint the picture of a ship that they've destroyed if they've been in an action with, like an aircraft carrier or destroyer. Well, the Canadian Navy has trains painted on the funnels. So it's very unusual that they have a book called The Galloping Ghost of the Korean Coast. And it's the story of the Canadian Navy in Korea. And they were the first ones there, by the way.
Okay. So you've mentioned you've returned to Korea. So you've returned a couple times?
Twice, yes. They have a revisit program where the Korean government, you are the guest of the Korean government, and you are treated with 5-star, treated like royalty. And when you're on the buses have got big signs on them in English and in Korean, Korean war veterans. And as you're traveling, workmen stop, people on the street, they're all waving and everything. So it's quite remarkable. And this is 60 years later. It's over, but not for them. As I was saying to someone, they're much like the Dutch people. They never forgot the sacrifice people. And there's a sort of a unique relationship with Canada in that they couldn't believe that we all volunteered. Almost everyone that was in Korea, the British, the Americans, they were all draftees or doing national service or conscripts. So they didn't have a choice. There was many volunteers, but most of them were draftees and national service. So they couldn't believe that these 35,000 Canadians signed up, volunteered to go to Korea, never knew where Korea was, and never met a Korean person. So they thought that was kind of neat.
And so the last question I have is, what is your impression of Korea now?
It's remarkable. It's what they've done, and it just proves to me what you can do with, and they're very strong in education, as you probably know, innovation, but they've done all that with no natural resources. It's probably worth mentioning that they have no resources. They're the 8th largest economy and climbing. Canada has every natural resource in the world. We're number 20 and we're falling. So kind of makes you wonder. But they've created a technological electronic world. Everything's electronic. They say it's the most people use electronics there more than any other country in the world. Everything, doors open electronically in a restaurant. You go to a coffee shop and you order coffee and a bagel with a bun or an egg on it or something. You get your coffee, a choice of 24 different blends, and it's brewed fresh. You get that, and you get what looks like an old-fashioned cell phone, the big ones, has a little TV screen. You can watch the news, the stock market, listen to the radio or music. At the bottom is a little digital square that shows you how many minutes before your order is ready. When your bagel's ready, it vibrates, and you go up and pick up your order. That's a coffee shop.
Okay, and we have one more question from Facebook. So are there many veterans from the war in the Coquitlam area?
There's only a few of us in Coquitlam. There's a few in Vancouver. There's quite a few on the island. I guess they wanted to be closer. That, by the way, is where the Canadian Memorial to at Beacon Point, Beacon Hill is on the island. Anyway, there's of the 35,000 that served both in the war and the 2 years after. There's probably about 9,000 left in Canada, maybe less. We're all getting pretty old. I'm one of the youngest, so you take a look. You figure that one out.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions.
So
So, you've got a bit of a closing statement?
Yes, if I may just
Of course.
close with this. I would like to say to people that the next time you watch a Remembrance Day service or any type of ceremony and you see the veterans, the old veterans, the young serving soldiers and cadets, and they play Old Canada, just remember, they always have and they always will stand on guard for thee. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, we have one more question. Just popped up, sorry.
Okay.
What area of town in Korea were you for your service? Or were you all over?
Well, I spent about 14 months right on the DMZ, and
Okay.
we were in Tokju and Uijeonbu, and when we landed, we were in what they called Pusan, but that has since been changed to Busan. They have changed part of their alphabet, like the famous Canadian Battle of Gapyeong, which we just celebrated recently. It used to be called Kapyong with a K. It's now Gapyeong with a G. The reason being, part of the alphabet was changed during the Japanese occupation. They were forbidden to use their own language, religion, culture, and everything. So they've done some fine tuning.
Okay. So I'm just going to plug once more our exhibit, 38th Parallel, the 71st anniversary of the Korean War, on display at Coquitlam Library City Center until May 31st. So please go and see it while you can.
And it's very good.
Thank you.